what is common for modern people, especially intelligent modern people, is to identify themselves with the contents of their intellect. But that's a strange thing to do in a lot of ways because, first of all, you're not just the contents of your intellect. You're also your emotions and your motivations in your body and your embeddedness within the social context. But especially if you're intelligent, it's tempting to identify yourself with the contents of your intellect. But there's no reason to assume whatsoever that those contents are in fact congruent with the programming of your body or even with its natural inclinations. And that's partly because you can learn abstractly, and that means you can pull in concepts from the world at a level of abstraction that may have virtually nothing to do with you. And that's certainly the case if you're educated, because you read all sorts of things, and the investigating that you do at an abstract level allows you to have theories about being and about yourself. But there's no necessity that those theories about being and about yourself have any basis in who or what you actually are. And so that can make you inauthentic. Carl Rogers, an American psychologist, would call that incongruence. You're not a singular entity at all. There are multiple levels at which you exist, and that can cause conflict. So, for example, maybe you're acting out an ideology because you're convinced of its rational integrity and coherence and utility. That utility and ideology doesn't fulfill you as an individual. There are thinkers like Solzhenitsyn who ascribe the worst catastrophes over the 20th century to exactly that kind of inauthenticity, which is the development of a coherent and rational ideology, say like the communist ideology, and then the attempt to force that on the world and add on people, despite the fact that the rational formulation and the reality of the people and the world have very little in common. Now, how would you detect your own inauthenticity or your own incongruence? Well, Carl Rogers had this idea that he called subception, which was something that you might regard as a kind of sixth sense. It's sort of like a propriocentric perception. It's your sense of how you're reacting internally. And a lot of that is triggered by the autonomic nervous system, which is reporting to you about various states of being in your body. And Carl Rogers believed that you could use the information that's being provided to you from your body to determine when you're being inauthentic or incongruent. And you can try this experiment for a couple of weeks. It's an extremely interesting exercise. First, you have to detach yourself from your thoughts and what you say. So you start by assuming that what you say and what you think is not necessarily you. And of course, that's just the case because a lot of what you think and most of what you say are the opinions of other people or things you've read or things people have told you. And that's a benefit in some ways because you get all of those thoughts that other people have spent a long time formulating. But it's a disadvantage in that it's not exactly you. So you detach yourself from that. You're no longer your thoughts, or no longer most of them. And now, we're going to try to find out which of your thoughts and things that you say are actually you. And my sense is that you can tell when you're saying something that's not authentic by feeling out whether or not it makes you weak or strong. You know, sometimes when you're conversing with people, you can say something that you know you don't really believe. So maybe you're saying things to impress someone, or you're saying things to remain part of your political group or your social group or whatever. So for 2 weeks, watch and see. Make a rule that if you start to say something and it makes you feel weak, and it's hard to describe exactly what that means. For me, personally, it means I can feel things kind of coming apart, sort of in my midsection. So I think it is an autonomic phenomena, and the subjective sense is that of falsehood. It's like I just stepped off the solid ground and onto something that it doesn't support me well, and it feels like I'm betraying myself. It's a kind of self-betrayal. So that's the existential inauthenticity that you could feel in the moment that it happens. And so then the rule is to just shut up if that happens. Stop talking. And then kind of feel around and see if you can find some words that you can say in that situation that don't produce that sensation. And all you have to do is notice, but you have to pay attention. And so to some degree, what you're doing, in fact, is you're making your capacity to pay attention superordinate to your capacity to think and speak. And you might ask yourself, well, what are you? And like I said, you can identify yourself with your intellect, and that's very, very common. But that isn't all you are. And there are a lot of reasons for making the assumption that attention is a higher order function than intellect, because attention is what teaches intellect. So very rapidly, you will find that much of what you think and say has absolutely nothing to do with you. Just a bunch of other people's thoughts manifesting themselves in your head. Like dead ideas that other people have created, and some of them might be applicable to you, and some may actually resonate with you. But lots of them, you're just using the words to camouflage, or as some kind of self-defense, or as an attempt to attain status in the status hierarchy, or to make yourself look smarter than you are. There's all sorts of reasons to hide what you think from other people. I talk a great deal about archetypes and how they have manifested over time in various mythologies and religions. One good example from mythology is from the ancient Mesopotamians. The ancient Mesopotamians had figured out 5,000 years ago or so that the highest god in the hierarchy of gods, so sort of like the highest value or the thing that should be imitated most carefully, was the god whose head had eyes all the way around it and who spoke magic words. And the words that this god spoke could make the sun rise and the sun set. So a very, very, very powerful speaker. And the reason the Mesopotamians had figured this out to the degree that they had was because they realized that the capacity to pay attention, which is the eyes, of course, and then the capacity to speak properly and authentically is, in fact, the highest virtue. And so then you can check yourself and you can see. And all you have to do is listen, like you would listen to someone else, and to feel and to think, do I actually believe what I'm saying and thinking in this moment? Or is it just cliches and other people's opinions I'm regurgitating? And I think what you'll find is that about 95% of what you say has nothing to do with you. So it's quite shocking to do this, because you'll start to say something and you think, oh, that doesn't feel quite right. Like it doesn't make me feel solid when I say it. There's something about that. I'm, subordinating myself to something, or I'm hiding in some way. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly what you're doing. But you'll find out that almost everything that's abstractly represented is very weak inside you. It doesn't make you feel solid. It's like what Carl Jung said. He said, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And that's something to really think about, because then you want to watch and see what ideas there are floating around in your head and start to figure out where they came from, because it's highly probable that they're controlling you, just like a marionette is controlled by the puppeteer. It's very, very similar, and there's an authenticity about that. Solzhenitsyn was a great Russian writer. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which was instrumental in bringing down the Soviet Union. And he was very much convinced that the reason the horrors of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and Mao's China and various other horrors around the world, he was convinced that the reason these horrors took place And the death and the torture of hundreds of millions of people happened was because the individuals that made up those societies were inauthentic in their own use of thought and speech. So it's a bottom-up pathology theory. It's the reason the whole state is pathological. It's because the individuals that compose it are pathological, not because they're good at following orders. I personally believe that to be the case, and I do believe that the catastrophes of the state are a consequence of the complex pathologies of the individuals, especially their willful blindness. So for me, and in my opinion, learning to become and grow into authenticity is one of the most profound things that you can do in your own development as a leader.